Metropolis. Here we have Dru Oja Jay, Executive Director of CUTV and publisher at The Breach. Today, we're going to talk about murals.
Indeed.
Downtown, artists, and more. First item up I have for us. There's a new mural. There's another new mural. Every year, Montreal's murals change at Mural Festival. With this one, not part of that. It's part of something else.
Okay.
But it's a mural nonetheless.
Sounds good.
I'm going to read the description of the mural here. There's a new mural in the village dedicated to Francoise Sullivan in honor of her 100th birthday. 10 artists with the MU Cultural Trailblazers collection have painted a mural dedicated to Francoise Sullivan, an artist, Quebecois artist, got big here in Montreal. Can we watch that clip? I think let's
watch
let's take a look at this mural. I'm kind of curious what you're going to think about what it looks like. You know, is it pleasing to your eyes?
We'll see.
There was a group of 10 young painters who dared to go up there and paint, and I'm very grateful to them. I want to thank them.
Technically difficult because the building is huge, but the design was chosen in regards of that, so it was a very fun mural to do because it's big fields of color. It's very, very humbling. I felt privileged to get just to meet her.
It hits me in the heart. It's amazing, amazing in my city.
That's not us.
CBC News is not responsible for anything that's about to be said.
They wish. That was Francoise Sullivan appreciating this mural that was dedicated to her life's work. She's 100 years old now. I didn't realize
just turned 100 this year, I think. Yeah.
I think that must be an incredible feeling, right? You have this like lifetime of work, and then you're getting this kind of appreciation. You know, Lord knows I don't get that kind of appreciation when I'm around. But listen,
well, you're not 100 yet, so
that's true. I have some.
Time.
You know, yeah. When I'm 100, get like a nice mural up of my stuff, which is, I guess.
Building size mural. You could do worse.
Yeah. I'm curious, Dru. What do you think about the mural? I know in the past you have little spicy takes on murals that I enjoy, but what do you? I guess before we get into the spicy takes on the murals, what do you?
Yeah.
What do you make of that mural?
Yeah, as aesthetics go for Montreal murals, I would say it's top tier. It's I think there aren't enough color-filled murals out there, and I love to see it.
All right, terrific.
Certainly, yeah. I feel like some of the stuff is a little too commercial arty, a little too airbrushy, a little too stylized, a little too leaning into the tourist. Like what a tourist would think that a nice, Leonard Cohen mural would look like, or something like that. Whereas this feels like, it's like a Quebecois artist, clearly venerated artist, and I think the art really does what it has advertised. It evokes a sort of a feeling in the body, a real presence.
I want to read. I want to read.
Yeah,
I want to read from
the
website real quick. This is how they describe this mural. Sullivan seeks in her paintings the emotion of the moment experienced intensely, seeking to awaken the sensation of self in an ephemeral moment. And I guess we do feel that a little bit. Maybe I'm going to be walking around Berry-UQAM and then boom, I see that and I'm like, ooh, the self. But
I felt myself.
Yeah, it's great. I felt that too. I was over here. I was like, whoa, what's happening?
I'm a self in the world.
Yeah, absolutely. Let's get into the spicy takes. Spicy takes. For me anyways, I think this is a bit spicy because it's the last time I had you on, you talked about murals and how I think you believe there should be policy about not quite disincentivizing them, but sort of.
I believe what I said was there needs to be a moratorium on murals and bike lanes until we take care of the real estate speculation issue.
So, This
We still
they
just
snuck this in.
spoiler alert. We haven't taken care of the real estate speculation.
So they snuck this in. They ignored your moratorium and put this up. And it's beautiful, but you want to put a moratorium. You want to get
the moratorium is not being respected.
Yeah.
I'm afraid to say.
Let's get into that. Why do you think there should be a moratorium on murals?
Yeah, we can pretend I'm not joking, but and I think what I said last time is I'm not joking until, or I'm joking until I'm not. But basically, bike lanes, murals, things like this that beautify the city, that make it a more pleasant place to be, and that just generally just notch up the quality of life in terms of the experience of walking around in the city. These should be unambiguously good things. What makes them not unambiguously good things is the fact that real estate speculation is out of control and is pricing everybody who has anything from the median income down out of the city completely. Go ahead.
So you don't think the mural's ugly?
No, au contraire.
Right. So I guess right now you're saying you don't want the murals.
The better the mural is, the worse it is.
Interesting. Yeah. So continue.
Well, in specifically in the sense that if you have unalloyed, unmitigated real estate speculation where people are paying ever greater amounts of their income in rent and literally not being able to live in the city, when you make it pleasant and attract more real estate speculation in as a result, the more beautiful a mural is, the more you're going to drive people out of the city effectively. It's not the only thing. But I think that we should make the city more beautiful, but we should also make the city more affordable. And we're doing one of those two things, which is making the city objectively worse.
It's kind of it's this unregulated beauty, right? It's everywhere, but it's not like, I think people like to think of beauty as this thing that's like apolitical, right? But I guess
unregulated beauty makes it sound tremendously compelling, but that's not what I was going for at all.
Okay, yeah. Sorry, my bad. I'll lock that away for something else. I think going back to the thing about like beauty and these things that we consider like aesthetically pleasing that we add to the town, that we think is like, this is easy to agree on, this is like apolitical, this is something that like it's good for everyone. You're saying it's not quite, that doesn't quite get to the issue of like what's happening underneath or what it kind of like allows for, right? Which is this, the beautification of, I believe you're saying is mostly beneficial, and especially beneficial to landlords and real estate speculators.
Yeah, no, I don't think that's true. I mean, I think as you walk down the street and you enjoy the beauty of the street, maybe somebody who's like, homeless and sleeping in the metro wakes up in the morning, steps outside the metro and sees this beautiful piece of art, and they enjoy it possibly even more than somebody else. I'm not saying it doesn't have positive impacts. I'm just saying that in a investment climate where the more pleasant a place is, or the better sort of aesthetic reputation is, the more it's going to attract investment capital to try to capitalize on that. The more that's going to drive up rents, the more it's going to drive up housing prices, and the more it's going to make housing a commodity, and thus more of a privilege than a right. And it should be a right. So, I guess to bring it back more directly to the artistic thing. I mean, I think when I first moved to Montreal 15 years ago, Montreal, it was a real artistic city. But there's sort of two things that made it an artistic city. One is when I walked down the street, I would have these sort of, I would see art everywhere. And I would, there'd be art that, I'd walk by places where bands were playing. I'd, see murals on the street. I'd see big art installations out in the streets, and it was wonderful. I really enjoyed it. I still do enjoy it. But living in a place that's so visually engaged. But the other half of that is that you actually have affordable rents, or below the national average rents in that at that time. We're talking about the early 2000s here. So I rented it wasn't a great apartment, but it was an apartment, room in an apartment for $250 a month when I first moved here. And a lot of other people were in the same situation. This is in Mile End. That's unthinkable in Mile End now. But it's
completely changed compared to
it's a complete transformation. I mean, you'd probably get the same place for $1,000 a month or something. But but now you have but then you had a situation where you had lots of people who were, sort of had a job, sort of were being an artist. You had lots of, in other words, free time where people could sort of hang out and live a more leisurely lifestyle, but also have this more free time to, like, I don't know, rehearse with their band or write poetry in the park or whatever it was, or to paint. And there was studio space where you could do that. There was rehearsal space. There's all these things that fuel the artistic life of a city. And those things are very quickly disappearing. And the reason for that, there's no good reason for it. The only reason for it is investment capital has been allowed to commodify housing and turn it into something that you make money off of.
So it's like back then, let's say you had the artists, you had this kind of public art, beautiful. You had like cheap, affordable rents where people could like have their jobs and still practice, have like time to practice their art, still have this leisurely time, even in between making art and having jobs. Compared to now, this situation where we still have this public art, we still have this beauty around us that's like abound, but now that's the material kind of section of our lives has completely changed. You're saying, like, now we have little less leisure time. There's less of the conditions. I think you said right to kind of create these kinds of arts, create the kind of conditions for this kind of blossoming of art.
Exactly.
So I guess what are some ways you think, if we had to go into like solutions, what are ways that we could kind of bring that back, where we have a little more leisurely time, where we have less of the pressure, I guess, of like having to work all the time? Or,
well, I think we can tax real estate speculation. That's the first and easiest thing to do. We can.
Don't you think they would increase the rent? Because just like, don't you think rents will go up to the landlords will try to make up for that tax increase with rent increases?
No, because they would be there. This bug.
Uninvited guest.
Landlords are in a basically a race because they benefit from real estate like value increases for sure. So they want their real estate value to go up. So because then they can sell it eventually. They can also jack rents out of proportion to that and blame it on the taxes or whatever. But the fact is, if you decrease the value of real estate by taking speculation out of the mix, then and you increase the supply of social housing to account for new immigrants and new arrivals to the city coming in, then you can overall increase the supply and as a result reduce the sort of supply demand balance and have an affordable city. I mean, Canada did this through the 70s. They spent a lot of money on social housing. They spent a lot of money on building up the housing stock. And that's why you could, work a part-time job and afford an apartment in Montreal. That's just not possible now.
Yeah, they're hard to come by. Sometimes you can still find them, but it's like, I find it's such a different terrain.
You got to know somebody.
Yeah. You got to just be swapping between people.
But I mean, just to come back to Francoise Sullivan, I mean, the situation that created an artist like that, who's clearly a justifiably venerated artist. She was a housewife who took a soldering class on the side and started making these sculptures in her backyard or garage or something. And would that even be possible now? Like, right, I mean, the number of people who can even be a stay-at-home parent, much less, have the sort of leisure time or like extra cash to like take a soldering class. Soldering, the number of those people in the society is diminishing. For most people, both parent, if you're a parent, you have to work 2 full-time jobs to like maintain a house. There's and to even buy a house, like you're going to have to rely on inheritance and so on to even get into that game, or some other sort of big cash influx. Like otherwise, how are you going to get a down payment? So, and then you're stuck renting, and then you're paying these increasingly exorbitant costs. So the city that's now venerating, Sullivan with this, beautiful mural, is now, is diminishing the conditions for the future Sullivans to come out of the woodwork.
I guess soon will just be Toronto, but with murals, but they still have like the high prices of rent and stuff like that.
Yeah, pretty much.
Yeah, people always complain about
they'll be hiring mural artists on Fiverr, flying them in from, I don't know, West Africa or something to like do the murals because there will be no
no artists here. Yeah, everyone's gonna be busy like just fixing the takeout robots at Starbucks or something.
Exactly.
Yeah. Dystopian. Let's move on to our next topic, Drew.
Absolutely.
Should we talk about? If we talk about culture,
We could talk about culture. Let's do it, Kalden.
Sorry about that, folks. I was just thinking. Let's talk about culture. We talk about artists. Other than murals, festivals. There was an article recently in CUTV News about Montreal festivals are fighting for funding and their lives. Mm-hmm. You read this article, Drew. Let me, for our audience, give them a little taste of some of these. Festivals like Pop Montreal give music fans a chance to catch up and coming bands. But Pop, like many festivals and fairs in the city, is finding it harder and harder to find funding. What do you make of that? Is that surprising to you?
Well, I mean, if you look at in the article, what that they specifically say is that the summer festivals are the ones being prioritized.
Yeah.
So I think one has to ask the question, why? Why are we prioritizing summer festivals? Why are those the most important? And basically what they're doing is they're creating all these grant deadlines that are happening in the fall when Pop Montreal is happening. So there's these tiny overstretched staff of Pop Montreal and other sort of fall festivals are having to like write grant applications while they're like running around venues, coordinating shows, doing all this stuff. And so it's totally untenable for them, right?
I think in the article they said there's some festivals that didn't know they would have funding until it was like 2 weeks away from the festival time.
Yeah, exactly.
Right.
So you don't even know if you're having a festival, until it's upon you.
Why do you think there's such a why do you think it's weighted so much towards the summer festivals?
Yeah, it's a good question. I would imagine it's because the people with political power in Montreal are the people who benefit from summer festivals, and that's tourism money, basically. Mm-hmm. So when you look at the millions and millions of dollars that Denis Coderre spent on the Quartier des Obstacles, as they call it, the downtown sort of Quartier des Spectacles. That's just anyway.
That's kind of funny. I like that because it does feel like that.
So sorry, just the joke is that people called it the Quartier des Obstacles, the neighborhood of obstacles, instead of the neighborhood of spectacles, because there's always a huge traffic lineup down there, because a lot of these things are traffic blocking. But I'm not going to complain about the traffic. What I'm going to complain about is that there's a business development model and a model of economic development for the city that's based on bringing tourists in to sort of like consume the city in this particular way. So you have these like fun art exhibitions that are going to get featured on Blog.to, where there's like a swing in front of a like metro station or something.
Right.
Or there's like these big interactive things. I mean, they're sort of neat art installations, but they're really designed to appeal to tourists. And the same thing, I think, with the festival season, which is obviously in the same area. Mm-hmm. All these festivals where you basically any given day, you go into, Barry Square, or you go at Place des Arts, you're going to see some kind of like big, musical act, or you're going to see some kind of festival is going to be happening. And there's all these vendors and there's all this money being made.
There's all these people being funneled into like the downtown kind of area.
Yeah. But who is making that money? There may be some like smaller local businesses, but really this is like capital intensive seasonal labor. In the same way that people are having this sort of intense experience of Montreal during festival season. There's a small number of people who have the ability to mobilize to pay the sort of fees to like and create the sort of business model where you're gobbling up all these tourist dollars in these sort of concentrated areas of festival activity. And so, yeah, it really favors the capital intensive, and it's probably high profit. And that profit is probably going to a small number of bank accounts ultimately, whether that's the bank accounts of like international investors or regional investors who are these sort of big pools of capital who are enlarging themselves based on this sort of tourist industry. Is it benefiting the people who are working there? Is that creating a long-term stable employment for those people? I would imagine not. I haven't done the studies, but tourism generally is not
reliable,
the best mode of economic development when it comes to the actual people working in it.
No, of course. I think you're talking before about Denis Coderre's kinds of efforts in the Quartier des Spectacles, and I'm wondering with the new administration with Valérie Plante, the article points out that the city of Montreal changed its festival funding program in 2022. Some organizations have complained that it has resulted in lost funding. So I guess what is the kind of through line? What is the kind of narrative that goes from how Denis Coderre handled festivals to how Valérie Plante is handling festivals?
Yeah, I mean, good question. I mean, there's probably a different set of interests there. I mean, my guess is that Denis Coderre was in tight with whoever was making a ton of money on on that
the big players.
Yeah, whereas I'd imagine that Valérie Plante is. I mean, again, I don't know. I don't have the insider info because this is all opaque to us, right? But my sense is that the set of political interests that she's representing are slightly different. She wants to keep them relatively happy, but not she, like Projet Montréal as a political animal wants to keep them relatively happy, but isn't willing to pour on the largesse the way that Coderre may have been interested in doing. But they're still serving those financial interests. But I mean, I think fundamentally the question is, okay, what's the economic development model that we want for our city? And is the kind of that mode of tourism what we're talking about when we're talking about that? Could there be another way to do it? And then I think the other question is, who is this art for? Like a fall-based festival that's in smaller venues that are sort of spread out over the city is, like Pop Montreal. I'm not going to say that people don't come to Montreal for Pop Montreal, because they do. But it seems more geared toward the people who live here and creating a sort of a cultural, fueling, it's one element of, but fueling a cultural life for the people who live in the city, as opposed to, creating this big capital accumulation machine.
I find there's a timing thing, especially with Pop Montreal, because it's always the fall festivals like Pop Montreal and for Montreal. I find there is this timing where it's they're happening right as students have settled into the city, right? Like Montreal's a big student city, new students are in, and then boom, now you have the fall festivals. Not again, like we're saying, it's not that it's not geared towards. It's not like a destination. It's not like a 3-day kind of Osheaga thing. It's much more like this week of shows spread out throughout the city. So it's the whole city is alive, and I find there's this thing where it's I just want to specifically talk about the students coming into a town for those kinds of festivals. I think the timing for that is kind of much more curious. I think reflective of what you're talking about with how these fall festivals are geared more towards people living in the city, right? And I'm saying a subsection of the people living in the city are these new students who are in, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And they're not quite people living in the city. They're still, a lot of those people come in even just for 8 months a year and then leave. A lot of them, but a lot of them do end up becoming a part of the cultural, the sort of cultural and social fabric of the city. But it's also okay, what's the economic development model that underlies that? Are we talking about fueling smaller bands and so on that that come in that are rehearsing in the city, that are touring and then spending their money in the city? That's one model of economic development, and then the one I described before is another model. I think these things are worthy of study in terms of how where the money goes, who ends up getting jobs out of the situation, and so on. I think just anecdotally, I know people who work in what people call the Godspeed industrial complex, which is Godspeed You Black Emperor, obviously being a very popular international touring band.
For those who don't know, huge post-rock band from Montreal. They won the Polaris Music Prize for, I think, their album Melodic. Fantastic stuff.
Yeah.
Hi, Morrow, if you're watching.
Absolutely good stuff. But the point is, they took that success the financial, windfall of that, and plowed it into creating a bunch of music venues, or some of them did, creating a bunch of music venues in Montreal. They created a record label. There are people who work at the record label, like answering the phones, like fulfilling orders, doing marketing. There are people who work at all those venues. Lots of, Montreal activists have worked at those venues, still do in some cases. Smaller bands come through and have a place to play, have a sort of a dedicated audience who sort of knows where to go to find sort of upcoming independent acts and so on. And so they are fueling the cultural life of the city in all kinds of different ways. And they're fueling the economic life of these neighborhoods where people live and work and have long-term stable income in a lot of cases that fuels their either artistic or activist work. And so as an economic development model, I'm not going to say it compares in size to the Quartier des Spectacles, but I am saying that I think we have to think about the quality of where that investment goes and where that sort of festival funding goes. And having the deadline in the fall shows very clearly where the priority is.
Of course. Yeah, so I guess this model with the Godspeed You Industrial Complex, that's much more rooted, I guess, in these communities, right? It helps kind of like lift people up, where these other like summer festivals a little transient, a little kind of like they're there, then they're not.
Yeah. I'm not going to say it's an endorsement of that model necessarily, but I think it does merit further study, and I think you can see, different interests being, I think there is a clear difference between people who are rooted in a neighborhood and in a cultural scene who put at least a significant amount of the money that they make with their success back into that world, versus the sort of extractive model of the downtown, tourist economy.
Interesting. Downtown. We're switching to our next topic, which you just brought up. Downtown.
We have our soundtrack.
We have this, Petula Clark, Downtown. Things will be great when we're downtown. Could we have the...
They will be. We'll find out why in a second.
Yeah. That's my job. Could we have the clip, please? So this is a report you sent to me, a little interview on this Montreal news show about, entitled, Montreal's office buildings are dying down. Let's listen.
There's about 50 million square feet of office, different class of office in downtown Montreal. And if you have 30% that are available, it's a lot. It's going to create, it's going to create less revenue for the city because the value will go down. And don't forget that 18% of all the budget of the city of Montreal is coming from l'arrondissement Ville Marie, from non-residential. It's not only office, it's retail, it's other things.
Yeah. So, for those, just to repeat what he was saying, that was Jean-François Grenier, the senior director of the Altus Group, reporting on the state of Montreal office buildings and its downtown sector. He was saying 50 million square feet of office space in downtown Montreal. And Drew, what percentage of them are vacant?
30, apparently.
30.
So almost a third of downtown office space is empty.
It's kind of unthinkable if we're in pre-COVID times, but we are not in pre-COVID times. We are in still COVID times. That's real. But
I mean, right behind us here, in the next door to the studio, there's a gigantic building that's being built, and I'm assuming a lot of it's I'm sure there's shifting in midstream here, but if it was office space, it's not anymore. Let's put it that way.
Right. Yeah.
And I think that there was an idea. Pre-COVID, certainly there was this sort of feeling that cities would only continue to expand. Commercial real estate would only continue to expand, both in value and in capacity in these cities. And so it was sort of seen as a surefire investment. A lot of international pension funds and big pools of international capital and national and regional capital are plowing their money in. It's like a safe investment, right? You build a giant building, you're going to make money.
In the heart of a city, of course, that's where everyone goes to work. But now we have this different scenario. People aren't going to the heart of the city.
Yeah, and I should say the development model of Montreal's transportation system is based on that assumption. I mean, the REM, the Réseau Électrique Metropolitain.
Express.
Oh, it's Express now. Sorry, they keep changing it. But the REM, in any case, is based on this idea that you have people who live all over the city and who all come into one central destination, do their stuff, and then leave at the end of the day. But that model is actually outmoded at this point. I mean, what this report says is like people are if they're coming into work at all in the downtown area, they're coming in 1, 2, 3 days a week, not 5 days a week. They're working at home a lot of the time. So you have this sort of emptying out of the downtown core. And just as an aside, I think the transportation model, a much more sensible transportation model would actually move people, around their neighborhoods or to adjoining neighborhoods, or like help them meet their actual daily needs, as opposed to subsidize the commute, for these commercial, interests who are, trying to get their employees down.
It would be less centralized, right? It'd be less everyone going to the center of town.
I mean, it is, yeah.
Yeah.
But now we have this like multi-billion-dollar infrastructure that is based on that idea. Anyway, that's an aside. But yeah, basically you have all this empty office space, and my question is, when is the price going to start to fall?
Yeah, because they're saying so you have 30% of all these units kind of available. Jean-François Grenier was talking about how in the report he was talking about how it's not like there is a bit of a shifting happening, right? Where he's saying that it's not like every building is equally empty. You have buildings like he calls them the AAA buildings, right? Like 1000 de la Gauchetière, like the big kind of like building right next to Bonaventure. That's pretty like I think it's at pretty like high occupancy. But that's because people from the other buildings are just because of these vacancies, they're kind of deciding to instead move into like upgrading their offices, right? So you have what he calls a bunch of like B and C tier office buildings that are very empty, and I think something that's interesting that you highlighted. So when I hear stuff like that, I'm like, oh yeah, like if there's
and they're upgrading their office, because they want to make like a really nice, comfortable thing. They have events and stuff. They're trying to get their workers to entice them to come in because
pizza party.
People, like why would you come in to a boring drab office? Like you gotta spice it up.
You gotta make it worth it. Yeah, you gotta make the commute worth it. I think something that was interesting whenever I hear like I think my kind of initial reaction to hearing, there's these empty offices. In my head, I'm like, let's turn them into apartments. Let's turn them into like condos, But he brings up how in Calgary, they because of an oil bust, where a bunch of these oil companies had like left Calgary, left the downtown center. You had all these empty buildings, and so what they tried to do was they tried to turn them into apartment buildings. But then what he says is it costs the same. Yeah. So I guess if it costs the same to turn these apartment buildings, and I think you're saying it costs the same because of plumbing, right?
Well, I think that's one of the things is like if you have condos, you need plumbing into the kitchen, you need plumbing into the bathroom, into each individual unit, and a bunch of different places. Whereas like the plumbing in these buildings is like very much down the core. You have like bathrooms in one sort of corner of the office, and otherwise you're kind of it's just space. Right. There's not all this sort of kitchens and smaller bathrooms and stuff happening.
So all this to say, like I think if it costs the same to like build a new building, then there's to refit these buildings and kind of like repurpose them. Yeah. What do you think should be done with these empty office buildings? Because I think in that episode we just listened to, I didn't hear too many enticing solutions particularly. So I'm wondering what do you think? What do you think are solutions to how do you use the space, and then also what do you do about the vacancies? Like in general.
Well, first, I mean, I was looking through a lot of the sort of op-eds about this and stuff in the Gazette and other sort of media outlets, and it's amazing how much. A lot of it just comes down to whining about the tax rate. They're like, it's the tax rate is too high, and that's why, these like things are like not being used. And that's, as far as I can tell, utter nonsense. Like the price, sort of a percentage of the price is taxes, but the base of that, what that percentage is taxing is a objectively higher rent. And again, it comes back to this idea that like the real estate values are just supposed to keep going up. People like to live by the commodity, but they don't like to die by the commodity. They like to they like it when the market's going up. And I think there's an overall feeling, because people got used to real estate prices going up forever, that it would just keep going without any idea about what the consequences of that are. And the consequence of that is that people don't want to rent your office space if you're charging that much. And so at some point, the law of supply and demand is going to have to come into play here. And I think there are a lot of like landlords. I'm not a tax lawyer, but my sense is that they're writing off a lot of the writing off these sort of vacant buildings as losses, basically, and then just recouping the cost and taxes. And so they don't actually lose money by leaving them empty for months and months, or they're counting on the sort of speculative change in land value or whatever.
Right. Like these vacancies for them, then you don't think stress them out too much.
Yeah.
That they'll just kind of sit with this emptiness and just kind of like they're fine with it.
Yeah, it doesn't seem to cause that much of a financial hit. I don't know exactly what kind of tax magic they work to make that happen, but it certainly seems to be the case. Certainly Schiller Levy was able to sit on the old KGB space after they ruthlessly kicked them out. This sort of like
right. I think they tripled the rent on them.
Yeah, they tripled the rent, and then it was empty for months and months. I don't know if it's still empty now, but
no, it was this like a little Mexican place. But then now that's empty again.
Right. Yeah. I mean, who can afford that? Yeah. But yeah, they're basically just holding out for these super high rents. Anyway, all that is to say that what I think should happen with these is that we need to go back to the Montreal of the 90s, where you had, take us back.
I'm in the 90s. The Habs just won the cup. I am 1 year old.
Yeah, everyone's wearing Patrick Waugh jerseys.
Everyone's wearing Patrick Waugh jerseys. What's that smell? Oh, I don't know. I don't know what's
Absolutely.
A nice smell.
So yeah, thanks for that time.
My pleasure.
Time machine. But yeah, back to the 90s when you had just the city was rife with vacant space and cheap sort of commercial landlords would look the other way and let artists just kind of occupy these giant loft spaces in sort of former industrial spaces and stuff. And so you had everything from co-working spaces to people sort of living in these sort of sketchy dorm style situations, collectives. You had art, giant amounts of artist space and all this stuff.
I guess that ties into what we were talking about before, right? With the kind of conditions that allow for this kind of artistry to emerge.
So it's going to cost you a lot of money to convert B and C office spaces to condos, but it would cost less money, I would guarantee, to just sort of let artists and other light industrial activities into there. You could have, everything from people growing mushrooms to having painting studios or band rehearsal spaces raves or
the possibilities are endless.
Illegal raves. I mean, this requires a certain amount of regulatory non-oversight.
Metropolis, we only endorse legal raves. Please ignore what Dru said.
Yeah, we in no way endorse illegal activity.
Yeah.
However, we do endorse the city. I personally endorse the city turning a blind eye to illegal activity. And this would create the ability to, if you had a little flex in the zoning,
of course,
enforcement, then it would create a big opportunity for people to do the things that made Montreal amazing.
Like if the city
in the 80s and 90s,
if the city administration kind of allowed changes zoning to allow for this kind of potential, right? To allow for this kind of to artists to occupy these spaces.
Yeah, and also close some of the tax loopholes so that the laws of supply and demand actually function, and so that landlords are actually forced to rent at a lower price. God forbid. And then that would open up a whole new world of activities in the downtown core.
We could move our studio there, maybe.
Absolutely, yeah. Why not?
Yeah, then we actually have this view.
I mean, just anecdotally, there's a big loft space just a few blocks down from here called that was occupied by a bunch of young people with various projects. There was I think it was one of the children of one of these big landlords had sort of leased it to somebody, and then they still had the keys, and they just sort of occupied it and started doing stuff. And it was just sort of happening for a while because there's all these empty places, they're just empty. And so all these different community organizations have started to set up little offices in there. There was a rehearsal space, there was a jam space, there was a lounge, they had parties, all kinds of stuff was happening there. All this vital community activity. It's not that in a matter of months that was online, right? When you have that space to do it. But then of course, inevitably somebody pulled a fire alarm or something and it got shut down.
You did, yeah. You were saying was, so I was like, well, I guess this isn't
It didn't last very long. But if the laws of supply and demand, if that landlord wasn't incentivized to just like leave it empty, and was incentivized to actually rent it at a much lower price to like cover their costs, then you have a different situation.
It could have stuck around, maybe. Right. It's fascinating. I want to talk about.
But just to be clear, it's the combination of real estate speculation and the idea that the land value is still going to keep going up. The combination of that and whatever tax loopholes they're using, that is allowing them to defy the laws, the supposed laws of the market.
Yeah. So you're like these apartments.
So market discipline for landlords is what I'm saying.
Right. Where they don't have that discipline right now, or it's like they're not really feeling like the pressure in any kind of sense to lower the prices, which is where things should be going because of that vacancy.
Yeah.
Right. To stay on the topic of sort of housing and stuff like that, there's an interesting development happening in Montreal where the city is running a pilot program to hunt down illegal Airbnbs. So this ties a little into the last topic. I think it also ties into this discussion before about tourists, right? Where we're talking about, is this city, are these festivals we have made for tourists more so than it is, let's say, for like our own residents? And I find this question of Airbnbs and these short-term rentals ties into that very well, where you have where you have units that are no longer being used to house city residents and instead being used to house tourists, because obviously you get much more bang for your buck from tourists and they get to make money hand over fist. Producer, can we have that clip?
Yeah.
I think this is very interesting. So, iPad just died. I believe it is. Oh, it's Ricochet. I think it's in the drive. Just one moment.
We'll leave it. I'll listen here. That's good. There we go.
Bonjour. Hi.
Oui.
Je m'appelle Yves. Je travaille pour la ville de Montréal.
Okay.
Je fais partie de l'escorte des résidences de tourisme.
This is Ethan Cox reporting for Ricochet Media and the Real News Network here in Montreal, where we have some of the same problems that exist across North America, a severe housing crisis and a real problem with short-term rentals. Well, we're here today to report on something brand new and really exciting. It's the first of its kind squad in North America, a dedicated team of municipal inspectors whose only job is to look into complaints that have been made by residents of illegal short-term rentals and give out tickets to the owners and operators of these ghost hotels. Yves Asano is one of 3 dedicated inspectors whose job is now very simple: shut down short-term rentals in Montreal. Today, we're riding along with Yves as he does a safety inspection at a short-term rental and responds to complaints about an illegal ghost hotel on a trendy plateau street. But first, we stopped in at Borough Hall to find out what's so special about this squad of inspectors.
C'est un projet pilote qu'on lance. Ça ne s'est pas fait ailleurs au Québec, à notre connaissance au Canada. Nous, dans le fond, on encourage les citoyens à faire des dénonciations. Le endgame, dans le fond, c'est vraiment de redonner ces logements-là dans le parc de logements locatifs pour tout le monde. C'est vraiment ça notre but.
Agathe Grandin-Côté is an experienced city inspector and the coordinator of this new squad. She and her 3-person team are now the city's first line of defense against illegal rentals. At the first apartment Yves visited, he met a woman who identified herself as a cleaner and told him the owner may live in Toronto. She allowed him inside to perform a safety inspection, which the unit passed.
Ils ont dit que les propriétaires semblent vivre à Toronto. Mais sauf que ça, c'est combien de jours ils vivent à Toronto, combien de jours ils vivent à Montréal. Ça, c'est des technicalités encore qui sont assez difficiles à aller démontrer et à aller prouver.
Yves doesn't want to get specific, but he has his suspicions about this rental, enough to justify further investigation. None of this moves as fast as anyone would like. Before issuing a single ticket, these inspectors will need to collect a dossier of evidence that will stand up in court. But once they've locked onto an operation, penalties can be steep. First offense fines of $1,000 to $2,000 and provincial fines of $10,000 to $100,000 that can be added on top. These may now be the largest fines in North America to match the first dedicated team of short-term rental inspectors. It's a small, halting step in the right direction for a city stung by allegations it didn't do enough to shut down an illegal ghost hotel that burned in March. That fire killed 7, including Airbnb guests trapped in rooms with no windows or fire exits, and prompted a flurry of legislation and new enforcement measures from all levels of government. The second building we visit is reportedly a ghost hotel, with all of its units being listed on Airbnb. Eve is here because of repeated complaints from neighbors. The woman who answers the intercom tells Eve she's a cleaner and comes regularly when the owners call for her.
Est-ce que vous nous permettez de pouvoir accéder au bâtiment? On devrait faire quelques vérifications.
Non, moi je suis juste une femme de ménage ici.
Okay.
Le propriétaire n'est pas là.
She won't let Eve in to perform a safety inspection, and, after promising to call her boss, she goes silent. It's enough for Eve to open an investigation and start gathering evidence. He and his colleagues say they'll prioritize the largest ghost hotel operations, issuing one fine per unit across networks that can sometimes span more than dozens of buildings, and working with provincial officials to bring crippling penalties down on repeat offenders. Start following the rules, the city is telling operators, or face fines that could reach 7 figures.
Our message to everybody who are doing illegal things, we are coming. The problem is when it becomes commercial use, so it's not sharing economy, it's something else.
We asked Airbnb spokesperson Nathan Rotman if he would agree to an on-camera interview to discuss this story. He declined. Like every other city in North America, Montreal has been asleep at the wheel. But if there's one message Mayor Valérie Plante's team is eager to pass on to the public, it is, we're working on it. We asked Plateau Mayor Luc Rabouin and other city officials for commitments that all data not protected by privacy rules would be shared with the public. They promised to make that data available, and we'll be back soon to check in on this pilot project.
That's not us either. What do you think about this pilot program? And do you think, I guess some questions I'm wondering, I'm like, is this enough to sort of, how do you say it, like disincentivize Airbnb? Because I know in New York recently they made them completely illegal, but it's kind of created this kind of shadow market of short-term rentals.
Sure.
Just first impressions, first thoughts on that.
I mean, I think we just need to rewind the clock for a second.
Back to the 90s? I'm there.
Not all the way back to that. I was going to say
I'm back.
The early 20-teens.
Okay, gotcha.
But, effectively, you had the rise of these sort of big investor-driven Silicon Valley companies like Airbnb and Uber, where basically they moved into traditionally like regulated industries, specifically accommodations, hotels,
Taxis.
and taxis. And they basically said, because we're an app, the regulations don't apply to us, and we're going to create this business model where people can like rent out their car or their home, and because it's on an app, the regulations magically disappear. Really, the magic of the disappearance is that they spent millions and millions of dollars hiring politically influential people. So they hired, I think, David Plouffe was one of their sort of key people at Airbnb. So he's at Uber, but Airbnb did the same thing. So David Plouffe is like one of Obama's sort of key people in the Obama administration, who then went on to work, basically going around and showing the sort of lobbyist firepower that cities are scared to stand up against. And so now we're like over 10 years later, after Uber had to sort of, because they were so aggressive, I think that there was some backlash. Airbnb sort of has snuck under the radar a little bit. I think the backlash is just starting now because you have that fire in the Old Port that actually killed some people because of illegal Airbnbs. And you have, regulations sort of creeping in around the edges, but the enforcement is just not there. Obviously, the plateau is probably on the forefront of that, of trying to enforce it, which is great. I think that's good. That's a good step. And I think, the plateau Projet Montréal people are progressive in that specific sense. But you have this situation where the whole, business accommodation and tourism accommodation market has been disrupted based on the lobbying power and the sort of novelty of technology is sort of combined to create this mess. And now it's 10 years later, the regulations are barely catching up. So that's, to me, the context that we're looking at here.
Right. Like, this is like welcome, but it's like, it's sort of.
But it took a decade.
It's like a very slow reaction to something that was kind of like building and building and building, and it was a clear kind of like from the get-go was this kind of curtailing of regulations, and now we have to try and like deal with the mess.
Yep.
Yeah, interesting.
But I mean, I have to imagine that the city could do any number of things that are a little more extreme than this, you know.
So let's say this is
like hire a few people to go scout out things and maybe like slightly dampen the enthusiasm with which, I mean, so basically it started out as people, you know, renting out a room in their house or whatever, but it's very quickly turned into people renting entire houses,
entire
apartments, and then just like renting them out full time. So effectively taking housing off the market, putting it into this like dubious thing, which takes money away from like unionized, you know, it was happening the exact same time as unions were really going after hotels and trying to make those into good paying jobs. And of course, Airbnb comes in and tries to pull the rug out from under that market. So I don't know how successful they were, probably somewhat successful. But yeah, so you have this situation where the regulation is barely adequate.
Yeah. So do you think these fines, like they're talking about those fines where like, I think the city could like levy $1,000, $2,000 fine, and if the case is big enough, but they're also saying about like how the cases could take 2 years, but they're saying if the cases are big enough, then from the province, you could have $10,000 to even $100,000 fines. I think even in the video, someone says something about like fines of like 7 figures, and I think that's not like a negligible amount. But what do you think are limitations of just going by like this kind of fines approach? If you think there are limitations, I'm kind of curious about that.
Well,
approach.
I mean, I think there is a fair bit of leeway. Again, I'm not the policy expert on this, but
or a tax expert, a tax lawyer.
Yeah, we're finding about all the things I'm not an expert in. But my sense is that there are municipalities that have taken significantly more stringent measures, simply banning Airbnb. There are certainly zones where it's just not allowed.
In Montreal?
In Quebec.
Right.
So what I would propose is that you just get rid of Airbnb and you replace it with something like, there's something called Fairbnb, which is basically like a cooperative, it's basically a cooperative structure that does the same thing, but it takes some of that revenue and puts it into community projects instead of sending it to
just siphoning it somewhere.
A bunch of venture capital.
Some guy in Toronto.
Yeah, no. Instead of sending it, well, not just to some guy in Toronto, but to a big giant pools of capital and like venture capital firms in Silicon Valley. That's where the money is flowing, right? But, from Airbnb.
Right. But sometimes some guy in Toronto is making money off it, right? I think they're talking about that.
They were talking about that, yeah.
I just want to make sure he doesn't get off the hook.
Well, don't let the guy in Toronto off the hook. But yeah, no, the guy in Toronto is one part of that value chain. I mean, basically they've mobilized an army of like wannabe landlords by creating this market and hyping it and using the sort of investment capital to make it immune, to use the lobbying power to stop proper regulations from being A, enforced, or B, put in place.
I know.
So I think Montreal could just create something else where it's not Airbnb. It's like actually benefiting the people of each neighborhood, and they could democratically decide like how much activity they want to allow. And if Airbnb is just banned, then we don't have to think about Airbnb. We don't have to like think about this cat and mouse game of like enforcement versus
chasing them down.
Yeah, exactly.
The case. Right.
Because you can enforce from the inside. You can just say, okay, we control the app, and so we just in the settings just be like, okay, we're going to put maximum of 9 units in this neighborhood, and that's it. Done. And then you don't have to have the cat and mouse game, and the profits go to stuff that is controlled by the community, and then you actually benefit the people who create that. I mean, that's the thing about housing is like, where does land value come from, right? Like fundamentally, it comes from the people who live in a place and make that place a nice place to live.
Artists, like we were saying before.
Certainly artists are a huge part of that. And that's why there's so much controversy about them creating gentrification, because they raise the value of a place, before and make it more appealing for richer people to move into. And because people are competing on a commodity basis for housing.
Big topics. What'd you find out about Airbnb?
Well, Airbnb is like popular in some like European towns, for example. Like, it's not. I don't know how much it's trying to get established in Canada, but there's so many different moving parts. I think the new regulations in Toronto might have made it hard for them to. They were trying to set up shop there, but the new regulations made it hard. So I think there actually is an effort to get it established in Montreal. But again, if they bring in new Airbnb regulations, it could inadvertently keep cooperative sort of efforts out of the mix. I mean, the ideal is that you have a city council who's like sufficiently disconnected from the influence of Airbnb and the sort of big capital backers that are driving it, and the big investment capital that's driving it, and the landlords certainly, and is able to just be like, oh no, we're going to do this totally other thing, and they could with a stroke of a pen turn Airbnb into like an international giant. Right, if they wanted to, but they would have to face off against lobbyists, and I think that's where we get into that very brief appearance of Nathan Rotman, who's like a key figure in the NDP, and who doesn't get nearly enough flack for being a lobbyist for Airbnb at the same time.
I think he was hired for the Alberta campaign, wasn't he?
Yeah. So there's a revolving door between the NDP, which is supposedly the social democratic alternative, which is supposed to be representing the interests of tenants. Against, the sort of depredations of companies like Airbnb.
But how can you do that when people like Nathan Rotman are working for the party?
Well, it's very difficult, right? When you have people who are that influential coming in and he just worked on the Alberta campaign, and then he goes back and works for Airbnb, and he's in charge of their, U.S. Eastern Seaboard and I think Canada sort of operations. So he's like overseeing all these lobbying. So he knows all the people, he knows who to contact, he knows what levers to push precisely from his experience, being brought into the halls of power by a political party that was created by social movements. It was created by the labor movement and the farmers movement, back in the day.
To bring things back to Montreal.
Yeah, go ahead.
Why don't you think, like, I'm sure this touches upon some stuff you said, but why hasn't like Valérie Plante just banned Airbnb? What do you think is a thing of courage? Do you think it's just not like, does she think it's impossible? I mean, we don't know what she thinks, but like, I'm just kind of curious what your kind of.
Well, it's not just Valérie Plante. Certainly, she would have a tremendous influence on that kind of decision, but ultimately, yeah. I mean, if you look at what are the social circles? I mean, Canada's a small country and Montreal is a small city when it comes to like political activists and operators and organizers.
Also dating.
I wouldn't know.
Small city.
I'll take your word for it. So the situation is that you have very small social circles. Everybody knows each other. Everybody who has any kind of political talent is in the room, is going to the same parties, rubbing elbows. Yeah, exactly. So, is Nathan Rotman going to the same potlucks as Valérie Plante? Maybe, maybe not. But certainly there's one degree of separation there.
Right.
Certainly he has had a nice conversation over beers with like one of her advisors or something like that, or one of the key players in the Projet Montréal. There's no way that didn't happen. And he's probably overseeing a team of of people who have been probably hired from the ranks of up and coming staffers for the NDP, for Projet Montréal, for other sort of progressive or pseudo progressive or not at all progressive political parties and political forces, and so they all know each other. And when you're Valérie Plante, if you want to sign that paper that says we're banning Airbnb and we're creating our own cooperative, Not that that's even on the table. Like
Right.
it would have to be demanded by social
Yeah,
movements.
so now I'm
to
in
even
the
get on the table.
I'm not in the past. I'm in the future. That
You're in the
doesn't
future.
exist.
Yeah. Just let's take us there, Kalden.
Yeah. So it's flying cars, new mayor, considering turning Airbnb into a real thing. I'm taller. We'll stop it there.
This could be the future, but Valerie Plante won't sign the paper. But yeah, so she signs that paper. What happens? Like, she definitely gets some angry phone calls.
Right.
Definitely has some people say, I'm not donating to your party ever again. Probably some multi-$1,000 donors. Probably some of her staffers hear about it from colleagues. Probably some like key donors from her like call her up and ask some pointed questions. It's very uncomfortable. Possibly it ramps up even further. Attacks in the press, front page of whatever. CJAD, Thomas Mulcair goes after her. These are all things that can happen.
Tommy the Bulldog.
Yeah, that's a whole other topic we need to discuss today. But they have ways of making politicians very uncomfortable, making life very difficult for politicians that sign those kinds of papers. But then, of course, to have that signature, then of course maybe you can do it through an executive order, but probably you need a vote of council, and then then Nathan Rotman's in there, work in the room, and then it's a race against time. Like, can your whip, can your party whip the votes? You have
faster
to mobilize
Nathan,
this whole apparatus faster than Nathan can have coffee with friends of his.
He looked pretty fast in that little clip.
Who they bonded, while either working on an NDP campaign in Alberta or went on a junket to like do democratic training in Libya or something together.
Yeah.
Like that, these are where those social ties get established, and then those get mobilized on behalf of capital.
We gotta grease those wheels. We gotta be faster than Nathan. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, I mean that's what it takes. I think we're in Montreal. Like social movements are so disorganized and not really thinking about these things strategically that we don't have a position. Like, is there anybody who's written like a one-page position paper saying we should just ban Airbnb and create a co-op instead? No, I don't think anyone has done that. So it's literally just an idea that I've observed in other cities, and I can sort of spout off about here. But that's literally where we're at. So, but the flip side of how small Canada is, of how small Montreal is that if somebody did do that, if somebody did start to agitate even a little bit, then the idea could spread very quickly and become very current very quickly, especially if it got a serious policy research treatment and somebody could match up, okay, here's the language that needs to be changed in this regulation, and so on, and vet that with people who have long experience and so on. If somebody was able to do that and then mobilize a little pressure, like the whole dialogue could shift very quickly. It just hasn't happened.
Maybe that somebody could be you, viewer. Dru, thank you very much for the discussion today. It's been incredibly insightful.
It's been a pleasure. Thanks, Kalden.
All right. We'll be back with the journalist segment. We don't have a name for it yet, but we'll be back. Solid. Hello, everyone. Welcome to the second half of Metropolis, where I have Savannah, Neha, the other journalists here at CUTV, and we're just going to be chatting about the things we've been reporting on, stuff we think is interesting, and I'm kind of curious what everyone's been up to. Savannah, do you want to start?
Sure. Well, Ode and I have been quite busy this month. There's been many events leading up to the National Day of Truth and Reconciliation, which was on September 30th. So we attended the national conference on unmarked burials. Journalists weren't allowed to attend all of the events, but we were able to attend a panel event that invited 3 Grand Chiefs from different communities, different reserves, to speak about how they're going about carrying out the search for unmarked graves and burial sites. So yeah, we had a lot to learn. I think one of the most interesting things I learned was that many of these communities are not conducting these searches in the same ways, which I think is good to understand, because I think when I've done research on this topic, I think the media hasn't always been forthcoming with how these searches are being carried out, which I think does kind of contribute to people feeling disconnected from what's going on and suspecting that it might be a hoax. If you want me to continue to elaborate, there's been other events going on as well.
Yeah, I think when you talk about I remember you discussing this point about how the processes are all different, and I think when I heard about that, I was like, oh yeah, it's true. Like when I remember hearing about unmarked graves, and I guess in my mind, and this completely, like, I didn't look into it, but in my mind the assumption was that like this must be some kind of, because again this kind of national attention, this kind of national coverage, that perhaps there is this equally national process behind it as well. And it's been really interesting hearing this, what you've been investigating and discovering that this is not like a unified kind of investigation or investigation of these unmarked graves, but it's really dependent on the community and how they want to, I guess, how they want to do it for themselves, right? Because these are like their ancestors, right? These are their kind of relatives or in these unmarked graves. And I think it's been enlightening hearing about this.
It seems that although there's been and continues to be many complaints towards the federal governments and other levels of governments as well, it seems that the federal government does want to be sensitive with this topic and this approach. So someone that I was able to interview at this conference, Ville Marie, she's the special interlocutor for unmarked graves and burial sites. It's a long title.
You
Thank
did
you.
it.
She is. She's conducting a report. She released a report in June, I believe, and her mandate ends next summer when she'll release her final report, essentially on how the government needs to address these unmarked graves and burial sites. And she made it clear that she's only going to communities that she's invited into. And she's meeting with survivors, families of survivors, leaders in the community, and just, other members of the community to understand how cultural sensitivity needs to be approached on these sites, and just other ways that the government needs to, I guess, address and support these communities, because I think it's made clear in this issue, but also just with other issues in Indigenous communities, that not all Indigenous people are the same, not all
Of course.
First Nations, Métis, Inuit are the same. So it's just kind of providing the time to respect what each individual in each community wants to be done in this process.
Fascinating. So I'm kind of wondering what the atmosphere has been like at these kinds of like events that you've been covering, the ones you've been to at least, because I think we see the stuff that you report on, we see kind of the processes at play here, right? These different kind of like government policymakers and figures who are like at these things. But I'm just kind of wondering, like, how are they received? Like, what are those things that like the camera and like we don't quite see in like coverage on these topics?
Yeah, that's a good question.
Thank you.
This doesn't necessarily answer what you don't see on the camera, because I think you do see this, but the emotion.
Mm-hmm.
But I guess maybe what you don't see is what you feel when you're there.
Mm-hmm.
It feels so heavy.
Right.
And I think it's just so overwhelming to hear the experiences that people go through, and not just what's happened in Canadian history, but the ongoing effects, intergenerational trauma that's occurring. And just I'm always so just like, wow, not only has this person or are these people going through this, but they're able to stand up in a group of, like 50, a few hundreds of people, maybe even thousands sometimes, and just kind of recount their trauma as a means to make sure that it doesn't happen to future generations or other people. And I think it's really heavy at these events. We've seen survivors come up as well. Some share their experiences, some don't. But I think it's just so, like, especially when people aren't connected to these communities to actually see them face to face and be like, yeah, like you're a human, you're not just
Of
a
course.
statistic in a report or just like a name in a story, these types of things.
Yeah, there's a lot of depth there. I think this kind of reminds me of the vigil we went to. Yeah,
Absolutely.
Because just especially when you talk about the heaviness of it, right? Because I remember, you can actually talk about it if you want.
Yeah, when Savannah was talking about that, I was just thinking about it too at the vigil that happened last week to commemorate the missing and murdered Indigenous women, girls, trans and Two-Spirit people. Like, yeah, the people that came to speak, the speakers were just incredible, and yeah, the heaviness is totally there. I think it's so moving to hear people talk about such personal experiences and share that with everyone. Like, you know, there was maybe 200 people there or something that day. And it's tough, but you also feel a lot of that support within the community that's there as well. And some people get through their stories, some don't, but I think it could be like cathartic to hear about it and stuff. And yeah, I think it's a really great place for people outside of those communities to attend and understand what those stories actually mean, because when we're talking about the conversation on unmarked burials and search the landfill movement and stuff, the darker side of that conversation of people saying, you know, why don't you just dig the graves up and things like that, it's not that simple and it's not that easy. And I think that's a really interesting element to this conversation, as well as when we look at these events and these stories, they seem really black and white, like how could someone be going against them? But yeah, like I had a conversation with someone just last weekend who brought this up and said, you know, why don't they just go and like take shovels and dig it up? Like, why are they asking the government for billions and billions of dollars that I have to pay through my taxes? And it becomes so much a us and them movement. And yeah, it's a much more bigger distance in those stories between one side and the other side, when it's so strange that it is like that, because yeah, it's these stories, these people that are going through this ongoing violence that keeps happening. So but the vigil itself was great. Like it was really powerful. It was a lot of good people that spoke, a lot of good energy. Yeah.
I think I like what you said before about how you see them supporting each other, right? Like I remember, I think that was one of the most touching things about being at the vigil, was seeing how you had these people really, like this woman who had like a tough time kind of speaking on these experiences, right?
Yeah.
About like missing and murdered, like relatives of hers, and actually like having that kind of like fear, these kinds of like traumas that they're expressing, and which is, I think, like on one level was like, I think it's incredibly inspiring, it's incredibly brave that they're like doing this and they have the support. It's like on that level it's inspiring, but then on the other level I find like when I see this thing and I'm moved by it, then there's a frustration that's kind of underneath it, right? Because they're talking about like, oh, you know, it's been like 2 years since the report on missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls came out, and there's been like, I think only 2 of the calls to actions have been like completed, right?
Right.
And then you're there and you're like, you're at the vigil and you're like, damn, like these people have been through this, and you get the sense that like, I get the sense at least that like that kind of inquiry was huge, because it's like this thing that they've known for like so long, so many decades, right? This reality that they've lived, and now that like the government's like, all right, this is like real, you know, we're affirming that this exists. We have this report that kind of like outlines how it happened, the violence of it, and how it needs to be solved. But then now here you have like the solutions are like nowhere, right? They wanted to do the act of like, no, we see you, you know, we hear you, and now when these communities are like, all right, now where's the change? Now it's like, that's when things start to delay, right? That's when things don't happen, and I feel like I could sense that frustration when I was talking to some of them. But there's also aside from the frustration, I think what was interesting at the event, and this is something you asked me to kind of keep an eye out for when we were there, was the election of Wab Kinew, the NDP premier in Saskatchewan, the First Nations premier in the history of Manitoba. And I think the question on our minds, at least on your mind and my mind, and I think here mostly, was kind of like, all right, this is like good to see. So now like we're talking about this kind of government delay, this government kind of like inaction, right, on these things. And now you have someone who's First Nations, who has family members who have been kind of through these kinds of things. Is that change going to happen, you know? And it seems people at the vigil seem kind of hopeful, People are like, are saying our brother Wab is up there. You know, it's like that's a win for us. You know, and they were celebrating that. You know, like in between the kind of like the mourning and the kind of commemorating the missing and murdered, they're still. I do believe they saw it as a sign of hope. But like, I mean, ultimately we will see how it turns out, right?
Because like the thing is also the things that need to be changed and what they're asking for, what needs to happen in general is not huge, massive, unrealistic things. They're just matters of public safety and personal security. Like if we look at the fact that like the Highway of Tears between Prince George and Prince Rupert, which is about I think about a 700-kilometer stretch of highway where hundreds of Indigenous women and girls have gone missing there. There's no public transportation at all in that area. And so women are forced to hitchhike there and end up facing a lot of violence in those areas. And so there's things like that, which is sort of a basic necessity of having public transportation and things like that there, which need to be pushed on by municipal governments and provincial governments as a whole.
Absolutely, great point. Oh, how are you doing?
I'm doing good.
Excellent. What do you have anything you want to talk about today?
I did think one thing that would be interesting to talk about is that we've talked about the Indigenous women, girls, district, and trans people vigil, but I think like the Truth and Reconciliation event Orange Shirt Day as well was very interesting. Like I wasn't able to attend myself, but I was able to see the footage that Savannah and Marie-Fleur captured, which I think was very interesting. Like the interview with Naguset, for example, where she was mentioning, you know, like again, like which goes back to what you were saying, Neha, where you know there's a bunch of promises, but they don't really deliver on their promises, and often they don't even understand the step that they're taking. For example, Naguset was talking about how the police, you know, reached out to ask if they could come to the Truth and Reconciliation National Day event. But they didn't just ask if they could come, they asked if they could come in uniform, which I think, again, is very, you know, it's a I don't know, like I can't find the word right now, but it just
problematic.
Problematic, exactly. Like why would you need to show up in your uniform, like especially knowing what your uniform represents, you know, and especially considering that what has the police, the SPVM, specifically done for Indigenous people in Montreal. And then, you know, and then I think she said like the year before, she had told them they couldn't come. So just the fact that they, instead of like, you know, they didn't reflect on what they asked last year, they just decided to go again and say like, we're going to come, you know, and then like say they're going to come in uniform is very disrespectful to me. And yeah, it's again, just to show, it really shows that they just want to be there for pretense. They don't actually listen to what is being said by Indigenous communities, you know, like the fact that they don't understand why they don't want them, because they're not gonna bring safety to the people there, you know.
It's kind of an intimidating presence, you think?
Yeah, exactly. And it's also like if you're really there to support, you know, the event and what's going on and like denounce the issues, why do you need a uniform? You can go as yourself. Like if you believe in the cause, you can go as yourself. You don't need to be wearing your blue uniform to be there. Like so that it's not for the communities. It's for you. It's for yourself. It's for your
image.
SPVM. Yeah, exactly.
To make sure your presence, you know,
yeah,
we're
exactly.
here.
And then what are they gonna do after? Is anything gonna be changed after? You know, they're gonna be able to say, "Oh, we were there," but
change within the SPVM, you mean, or
no, like change for Indigenous communities.
Right, of course.
You know? And I think I don't know if you remember Savannah, but I think Nagu said I had also said something about Fadi Daher.
So I believe it was last year. I've interviewed Nagu said many times, but we were speaking earlier this year.
Could you just speak about that? Who Naguset is?
Yeah,
No.
Naguset is the executive director of the Native Women's Shelter here in Montreal, and she also works with Resilience Montreal, which is a shelter that has how do I say this? It helps. It's near Cabot Square, which is like a notorious place for Indigenous people to gather. So some of their clientele are Indigenous as well.
Right, of course.
At Resilience Montreal. But no, when I had interviewed Naguset, it was actually earlier this year, she mentioned this, but we were speaking about the class action lawsuit that's being put against the city of Montreal for racial profiling. So essentially people who have experienced racial profiling between 2017, I believe it's around 2017 to 2018. I don't recall exactly, but it's around that time frame. The Black Coalition of Quebec is suing the city of Montreal in order to get $5,000 for each person who's experienced racial profiling and arrest without a valid reason. So we were speaking about this case during this court process. There were no Indigenous like leaders within Montreal or Indigenous organizations present. And we were speaking about that, and she was essentially saying like, well, we don't want to re-traumatize our community. And she's like, honestly, we're just exhausted with trying to work with the city, trying to work with police. So she's like, we're focusing our efforts on actually supporting people within our community. And what she had said about the new police chief, Fadi Dachre, was that she's, I believe, you might know this, he worked in Longueuil, right? Like,
Yeah.
Do you know his title?
I can't recall the title, but I remember before Montreal, he was in Longueuil.
Yeah, in like a high up position.
Yeah.
So she's known him. He's had other positions in Montreal. She's been in contact. So, someone on behalf of the Native Women's Shelter, Naguset, asked them to reach out to Fadi when he came into his new role of the Chief of Police of Montreal to set up a meeting and essentially discuss, how are we going to make sure Indigenous people in Montreal are safe, and speak about things like racial profiling. She said that she was ignored. The Native Women's Shelter was ignored. So at this event on September 30th, when I interviewed her again, and it made me think of it when she brought up, the police wanting to be there. I said, oh, I remember earlier this year you told me that you were ignored by the SPVM asking to have a meeting. And I was like, any updates? And she said, no.
Wow.
I think she said that they reached out again and still nothing. So
I assume they want to be there for PR, for like the...
That's exactly what I was referring to, exactly.
What Ode was saying earlier about the kind of like the photo op and the PR of the SPVM and just police forces in general, I'm sure. It reminded me a little bit, I believe Ode and I attended the National Day for Truth and Reconciliation together last year, or at least some other events around the time, but I was speaking either with Naguset or David Chapman, who's the executive director of Resilience Montreal, about how I've been to the last two events the last 2 years, and each time it gets smaller and smaller. And the first one, it was either at the 2021 National Day for Truth and Reconciliation, or that year the gathering that happened after the 215 graves were discovered at Kamloops. Is that I saw Valerie Plante there, other politicians. There's a lot of photos being taken of them while they're at these events, and then the next year, this year, we don't see them. We don't see as many people, and I think kind of being there is one thing, but having your photo taken at these events, I think some people can find it disrespectful, especially when there's survivors there of residential schools and just people recounting their trauma, to kind of like go and take it as an opportunity to have a photo op, like just go there and support the community and show you're there to make change.
Sort of like virtue signaling that goes on in that space. Yeah.
There's so much of it that's just like people are just desperate for like especially like the boys, like police, people are desperate for like just positive kind of public opinion, and they want to do the least amount of work for like the biggest gain, right? And I find these highly publicized events with Indigenous people is like, I find what it sounds like is they see that and they're like, this is our opportunity to try and like wash ourselves clean of any kind of like criticality, and like we'll just be at the event, we'll be in our uniform, so people will see us, they'll be like, oh, that's police, they're at the event, so they must be like working with them, but clearly they're not. Clearly, like any kind of attempt that's like olive branch, that's like kind of reached out to them. It's kind of not really
closed door meetings.
Yeah, no, exactly, literally. No, yeah.
No photo op opportunity.
No, exactly. Yeah. Sorry, no cameras, no selfies. Wow. Yeah, thank you for bringing that up. Yeah. I think it's important to remember these things because, I mean, so often so there's so many people, right? They see their interactions with the police, if they're lucky enough not to have common often interactions with them, is going to be through things like media, right? And that's where it's so important to have this kind of knowledge of what's happening behind the scenes, right? It's like what you see on the screen is yeah, of course, maybe there's going to be cops at this thing, maybe they're going to be looking like they're doing all the good moves, they're doing all the right PR, sort of like what you were talking about with with Mark Miller, was it?
So I can't remember if it was Mark Miller exactly. I know that it was a representative at Parliament or someone within government, but I attended with Marie Fleur it was the national. I'm trying to recall the exact title, but essentially September 18th was declared a day to nationally search the landfill. So to kind of provide a summary, last year in Manitoba, there were numerous amounts of Indigenous women who were murdered by a serial killer, and 2 were discovered in Brady landfill, and there are suspected to be 4 that have been Indigenous women who have suspected to be dumped in Prairie Green landfill. And there's a movement that's been put forth by family members as well as Indigenous leaders in the area and other community members to push for a search. Essentially, the former provincial Manitoba government and the still current federal government have said that they will not carry out these searches. It's dangerous. There's hazards such as asbestos. It could take up to 3 years. So essentially, it's not worth it. It's not worth the resources, the money, all these things.
Specifically, I want to know more about the offering that was given to this.
Exactly. I just want to provide a bit of context.
No, of course,
but at this kind of gathering at Place du Canada on September 18th, one of the family members said that they were in a meeting at Parliament that same day, and a minister gave her ceremonial tobacco. She didn't use the words peace offering, but it's kind of this thing.
Has the implication?
Yeah, culturally respectful, all these things. And essentially the outcome of the meeting was that they were not going to search the landfill. So she said that at the end of the meeting, she essentially told this minister she was respectfully declining this tobacco, as she essentially, the federal government wasn't giving them what they were there for. They were not there for, gifts or anything. They're there for the landfill to be searched.
Yeah. So, when I hear about that kind of ceremonial offering, right, that to me it's not quite the perfect. I mean, it's never going to be a perfect comparison, but that there's something about that kind of reminds me of this thing about police wanting to be seen, kind of at the vigils or events, like Indigenous kind of led events with their kind of uniforms, right? There's the optics of it, right, where you have this one minister who wanted the optics of let me be seen as being kind of not collaborating, but being kind of friendly, trying to be we're kind of working on this together, And I think it's incredibly strong for the person who have been it's strong. I think it's good and it's principled that this person was no, we don't want this, I have to give this back, And I don't know. To me, it all ties into this thing where you have all these kinds of very publicized moments, and then underneath it, which doesn't get publicized as much because it's less of a. I think it's more of a story, but it's revealing when you hear about the kind of inaction, right, and how much people want to rely on these publicized moments to fuel further inaction. Yeah.
Well, I think that's why we sort of need someone to keep track of whether people are living up to those promises or not, and
that's us. That's
yeah,
our
have kind of watchdogs saying hey, you promised to give this much money. 3 years ago when this movement was at full peak, and now what has happened to that, you know? Whether it's like philanthropy or other large corporations that want to look good for the public and then suddenly drop off when no one's paying attention to them anymore. But it so often happens, obviously.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Anything else we want to cover? Has been on our radars?
So much is just circling in my head. I can't even think of it.
Yeah. I think we can leave it there for now. This was nice. Thank you everyone for coming onto the show, and
Thank you for having us.
of course. I had no choice. Thank you very much, everyone, for this another episode of Metropolis. We're still figuring things out, but thank you for watching. We appreciate the support. Have a great week. Everyone wave. We're all waving.